The road to the monastery was not marked on any map. It wound through a dense, breathless forest, where even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. The travelers had not planned to come this way, nor had they ever heard of St. Gertrude's monastery before. It was the kind of place that existed only for those who needed it, though what exactly it was offering them remained unclear. There were 5 of them. Marcus, the leader of the group, who always claimed to know where he was going, even when he didn't. Olivia, his skeptical fiancée, who had already suggested turning back more than once. Ethan, their quiet companion, whose fascination with abandoned places had led them here. Sophia, who was nursing a twisted ankle after a misstep on the rocky path. And Daniel, who had been the first to notice the monastery's silhouette in the mist. The journey had been long and fruitless, an aimless exploration of ruins and forgotten places. But now they stood before something ancient and intact, as if waiting just for them. The monastery loomed at the end of the path, its dark stone walls weathered by time, yet unervingly whole. Ivy crawled up its surface, wrapping around arched windows like grasping fingers. A great wooden door, adorned with iron hinges that had rusted to a deep, bloody red, stood slightly ajar. It exhaled a breath of cold air, as though the monastery itself had just awakened. "This place gives me the creeps," Olivia muttered, rubbing her arms against the sudden chill. "Which makes it perfect." Ethan grinned, already pulling out his camera. "Do you realize how rare it is to find a monastery this intact? No graffiti, no signs of squatters, just history. Or something worse," Sophia added under her breath. No one acknowledged her unease. The door had already drawn them in. Marcus gave it a gentle push, and the heavy wood groaned open, revealing a cavernous interior swallowed in shadow. Dust swirled in the beams of the fading sun, disturbed by their presence. The scent of old parchment, wax, and something faintly metallic filled their lungs. The monastery was silent, yet its silence felt occupied. Ethan's footsteps echoed as he stepped inside, his camera's flash momentarily illuminating a massive hall. Rows of wooden pews stretched before them, leading up to an altar cloaked in darkness. Stained glass windows, dulled by years of neglect, lined the walls, their depictions of saints and martyrs barely visible beneath layers of grime. Yet there was something strange about them. The figures were faceless, their heads blurred as though time itself had erased them. "Creepy," Daniel whispered, running a hand over the stone pillars. "It feels wrong. Only because it's old." Marcus scoffed. "Look, let's stay here for the night. It's better than trekking through the woods in the dark." No one argued. The cold of the monastery was preferable to the uncertainty of the forest. But as they settled in, none of them noticed the faint sound that stirred from the shadows, the whisper of robes dragging against the stone floor, moving just beyond the edge of the candlelight. Night settled uneasily within the monastery, bringing with it a heavy silence that pressed against the travelers' ears like an unseen weight. They had set up camp in the main hall, spreading their sleeping bags across the cold stone floor between the wooden pews. The firelight from their lanterns cast long, flickering shadows against the walls, distorting the faceless saints in the stained glass windows. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but within the monastery, all was still, too still. Ethan, unable to sleep, sat cross-legged with his camera, reviewing the pictures he had taken. The dim glow of the screen illuminated his face, his brows furrowing deeper with each image. The architecture was breathtaking, the details of the carvings remarkably well preserved. But in one particular shot, one he was certain had been empty, he could make out the faint outline of a figure standing in the farthest row of pews, half shrouded in darkness. "Guys," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I think someone else is here." Marcus groaned, rolling over. "If it's a ghost, tell it to come back in the morning. I'm exhausted." Ethan clenched his jaw, but said nothing more. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about this place unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He shut off the camera and lay back, staring up at the high, vaulted ceiling. Above him, the wooden beams stretched like the ribs of a great, slumbering beast. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint, rhythmic, almost melodic. It drifted through the darkness like a breath of wind slipping through a crack in the stone. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But then Sophia sat up abruptly, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked, eyes darting toward the altar. Olivia sat up too, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Hear what?" Before Sophia could respond, the sound grew louder. It was a low, murmuring chant, the cadence steady, deliberate. It echoed through the halls, as if coming from the very walls themselves. It was in Latin, at least it sounded like Latin, but the words were muddled, distorted, as though being spoken through water. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. A silence deeper than before, thick and suffocating. The 5 travelers sat frozen, their breath shallow, their skin prickling with an instinctual fear. Then, just as Marcus opened his mouth to dismiss it, the whispering resumed. Closer this time, impossibly close. And in the darkness beyond their lanterns, something shifted. The whispering had been enough to send a cold shudder through each of them, but it was the movement in the darkness that truly gripped their chests with fear. A shifting, barely perceptible disturbance in the air beyond their fragile circle of light. None of them spoke. None of them dared to breathe too loudly. Every instinct screamed for them to stay still, to listen. Marcus, ever the skeptic, forced himself to his feet. "It's probably the wind," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He took a cautious step toward the aisle, where the shadows stretched long and hungry across the floor. The silence now felt weighted, charged with something unseen. Ethan turned his camera back on. It screened dim, but enough to cast a weak glow in the surrounding darkness. He raised it, shifting the lens toward the altar. The display revealed nothing at first, just rows of empty pews and the towering stone walls. But then, in the farthest part of the hall, just before the archway that led deeper into the monastery, something stood. A shape, cloaked in the same darkness that surrounded them, watching. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't move." Marcus froze. "What?" "I see someone," Ethan hissed. "Right by the archway." Olivia clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't mess around, Ethan." But Ethan wasn't joking. He swallowed hard, adjusting the camera to get a clearer look, but as soon as the screen refocused, the figure was gone. Not gone in the way a person would move or step back, but in the way mist vanishes beneath the morning sun, as if it had never been there at all. Marcus, now visibly uneasy, took a careful step back toward the group. "If this is some kind of prank, it's not funny." "It's not," Ethan whispered. "I swear." Sophia was trembling now, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "We shouldn't be here." Daniel, who had been the quietest among them, spoke up for the first time. "We're not alone." His voice was steady, but his eyes darted to the archway where Ethan had seen the figure. Then, as if in response, a sound rang out, a single deliberate footstep from beyond the archway. The unmistakable scrape of a boot on stone. It was enough. Marcus grabbed the lantern, lifting it high to cast more light into the space ahead. But the archway beyond the pews remained empty, just a yawning blackness that seemed to deepen as they stared into it. Then the whispering returned. This time, it did not echo from all around them. It came from that very archway. Low, urgent and wrong. A single voice at first, then two, then more, an entire chorus of unseen lips murmuring in unison. And just beyond the veil of darkness, something moved. The whispering voices multiplied, layering over one another in an eerie chant that rose and fell like waves against the monastery walls. Each word, though unintelligible, carried a weight that pressed into their skulls, like unseen hands gripping the edges of their thoughts. The sound wasn't coming from the wind. It wasn't a trick of the acoustics. It was here, in the room with them. Ethan gripped his camera as if it were a lifeline, pointing it toward the dark archway. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't see anything, but I feel it." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Something's there." Olivia's hands trembled as she clutched the fabric of her hoodie, her knuckles turning white. "We need to leave. Right now." Before anyone could respond, the air in the monastery shifted. A change so sudden and profound, it was as if the very stones around them were inhaling. The temperature plummeted and their breath fogged in the air. The lantern light flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the floor. Then, from the archway, the sound of footsteps. Not just one pair, many, slow and rhythmic, as though an invisible procession was making its way toward them from the darkness beyond. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if following an ancient ritual. And then, the chanting changed. It grew clearer, more structured. Latin phrases that Marcus, who had studied the language in college, barely recognized. Words of devotion twisted into something else. Something wrong. He strained to catch a translation, his mind racing. Domini exaudi vosum meum, labora nos. Lord, hear my voice, deliver us. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell upon them like a heavy shroud, thick and absolute. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Then Marcus, against his better judgment, took a step forward. "Marcus, don't," Sophia whispered, but it was too late. As his foot crossed the threshold of the aisle, the lantern's glow caught movement in the pews ahead. Shadows shifting where there should have been none. Shapes forming, then dispersing, as though something just beyond the reach of their vision was trying to materialize. And then they saw it. A robed figure stood in the second row of pews, head bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. Its form was indistinct, wavering like smoke, but its presence was undeniable. It was there, real, watching them. Then the head lifted. There was no face beneath the hood, only darkness, infinite and yawning, as if the robe contained a void in the shape of a man. Ethan stumbled back, nearly dropping his camera. Olivia let out a strangled gasp. Marcus was frozen in place, eyes locked on the entity before them. Then, the unseen congregation spoke in unison, their voices weaving together into one chilling command. "Prostrate et orate." Kneel and pray. The lantern's light flared violently, then extinguished, and the monastery was swallowed in complete darkness. The darkness was not empty. It pulsed like a living thing, pressing in on them, wrapping around their throats like a funeral shroud. Olivia clutched Ethan's arm, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Marcus stood rigid, his fists clenched, as though sheer defiance could keep the void at bay. Then a sound. Not footsteps, not whispering, something deeper, more resonant. A slow, deliberate exhalation, as if the monastery itself was breathing. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something else, something ancient, like burned parchment and decayed incense. Sophia fumbled for her phone, her trembling hands struggling to ignite a sliver of light. The moment the screen's glow pierced the gloom, they saw them. The monks, dozens of them, lined in the pews, kneeling, their spectral robes undisturbed by movement, their heads bowed in eerie devotion. Their forms were translucent, flickering like candle flames, yet there was no mistaking their presence. It was as if they had been there all along, waiting, watching. Then one of them moved. The nearest figure slowly lifted its hooded head, revealing the same void where a face should have been. No eyes, no mouth, just an abyss of utter nothingness. And yet they all felt its gaze. Ethan staggered back, his breath ragged. This can't be real. His voice cracked. This is some kind of... A low, guttural chant interrupted him. Rising in intensity, the spectral monks moving in perfect unison. Their voices swelled, forming a language older than time, a hymn of the forsaken. Then, as if by some unseen force, Marcus fell to his knees. His mouth opened, his body trembling, his lips moving soundlessly as if reciting the words himself. "Marcus!" Olivia shrieked, grabbing his shoulders. "Get up!" But he didn't react. His pupils were dilated, his skin pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. His lips moved faster now, the language spilling forth from his mouth in perfect harmony with the monks. Sophia was sobbing. Ethan was frozen in fear. Daniel took a hesitant step forward, his voice shaking. Marcus snapped out of it. And then Marcus stopped. His mouth snapped shut. His eyes fluttered. A second of silence stretched unbearably. Then he let out a scream so raw, so utterly inhuman, that it shattered the very air around them. And suddenly, the spectral monks turned their heads in unison toward them. The lantern, long extinguished, flared back to life with a violent burst of light. But the pews were empty. The monks were gone. The whispering had ceased. And Marcus, his body shaking, looked up at them with wide, horror-stricken eyes. "They know we're here," he whispered. And in the distance, beyond the archway, something knocked. A slow, deliberate pounding on unseen doors. 3 times, as if something had just awoken. The echoes of the 3 knocks reverberated through the monastery, bouncing off the ancient stone walls with unnatural clarity. The group stood motionless, their breath shallow, as if any sound from them might provoke a response from whatever had just announced its presence. The knock had not come from the entrance. They had sealed that door themselves upon entering. No, it had come from within. Ethan swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his camera. The lens reflected the dim glow of the flickering lantern, but the screen was nothing but static. Did anyone else hear that? His voice barely rose above a whisper. Sophia nodded, hugging herself tightly. "Of course we heard it," she snapped, though fear had drained all bite from her words. It came from inside. Marcus, still kneeling, wiped his clammy forehead with a trembling hand. His voice was hoarse, ragged, as if something had been forcibly wrenched from his throat. "I wasn't," he started, but his voice faltered. "I wasn't in control. I felt something inside my head." He shuddered violently. Something ancient. Olivia stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "You're here now," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're with us." A second knock, this time closer. Daniel turned toward the archway at the far end of the monastery's nave, his jaw clenched. The vast darkness beyond seemed to ripple, as if it were breathing, as if something was watching from just beyond their perception. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now!" But before anyone could move, the third knock came. Not distant, not beyond the archway. It came from right behind them. Ethan spun around, nearly dropping his camera. The pews were empty. The walls were lined with crumbling tapestries, their sacred imagery long faded. And yet, the presence was undeniable. It loomed over them like an oppressive weight, unseen yet suffocating. Then the whispering returned, not the chanting of the spectral monks. Something else, a singular voice, hollow and stretched, weaving through the air like tendrils of smoke. The words were foreign, but the intent was clear. It was calling. A low creak echoed through the nave, and their gazes snapped toward the source. The wooden door at the far end, the one that had been locked when they arrived, was slowly opening. The hinges groaned as if reluctant to move, yet the unseen force behind it was insistent. Inch by inch, it revealed the abyss beyond, a void darker than even the monastery's shadowed corridors. The air changed again, thick with a sickly sweet aroma, like rotting flowers left too long in a crypt. Ethan lifted his camera, but the lens cracked with a sharp, splintering noise. He let out a startled curse and pulled it away from his face. A single jagged fracture now ran through the glass. Marcus, still shaken, turned to them, his face pale as parchment. "It wants us to go inside." And then, from the other side of the door, something stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressive. A single, measured step, and in the flickering lantern light, the first hint of a shadow fell across the threshold. The shadow lengthened across the threshold, stretching unnaturally, its edges curling like smoke. The air in the monastery thickened, pressing against their lungs as though unseen hands were tightening around their throats. Olivia's fingers dug into Marcus's arm, her nails sharp against his skin. No one dared to move. Sophia let out a shallow breath, her voice barely a whisper. Who's there?" No response. Ethan's fingers hovered over his broken camera, as if the device could still offer some sense of control, some barrier between them and whatever had crossed into their reality. His pulse pounded in his ears, a frantic rhythm against the suffocating silence. Then the shadow moved again. Another step. This time, the shape took form. A figure draped in tattered robes, its edges frayed as though time itself had gnawed at them. The hood was deep, swallowing any glimpse of a face, but the way it tilted, the slow, deliberate motion, it was watching them, studying them. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat raw from his earlier episode. It's one of them, he whispered, voice barely audible. The monks. Daniel took a step back, his instincts screaming for him to run. But where? The only exit was the door they had come through, and the presence of this figure suggested that leaving might not be an option anymore. What do we do? He hissed under his breath. The monk lifted an arm. A sleeve tattered and threadbare swayed with the movement, revealing fingers that were impossibly long, too thin, as though the flesh had withered away, yet refused to decay entirely. It gestured toward the open doorway. It was inviting them inside. Sophia shook her head violently. No way. We are not walking into whatever trap that is. But Marcus, still kneeling, his breath coming in ragged bursts, spoke without looking at them. I think we have to. His voice was distant, hollow, as though he had already seen what was beyond the doorway, as though some unseen truth had already settled into his bones. Ethan turned toward him sharply. Are you out of your mind? Marcus met his gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable. We came here looking for proof, right? He gave a weak, humorless smile. Well, I think it found us first. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating in their chests. The monk had not moved, yet the sound seemed to come from all around them, from the walls, from the floor, from the very stone that had stood here for centuries. And then the whispering returned, not in Latin, not in any language they recognized, yet they understood the meaning all the same. Enter, or be taken. The light of the lantern flickered violently, casting jagged shadows that danced across the monastery walls. The doorway gaped before them, its darkness swallowing the last remnants of warmth from the room. And before any of them could make the choice, the door behind them, the one they had locked, slammed shut with a deafening finality. The sound of the door slamming behind them rang through the monastery like a gunshot, shattering the tense silence. Sophia spun around, rushing to the entrance they had sealed upon arriving, her hands fumbling against the old wooden planks. She pulled. She shoved. It didn't budge. Ethan cursed under his breath, backing away from the closed door as though expecting it to burst open again. But no, it held firm. It was no longer just locked. It felt sealed, as if the monastery itself had decided they were not leaving. The whispering swelled around them again, curling in the air like smoke, pushing at the edges of their thoughts. The monk at the threshold remained motionless, waiting, its head tilted slightly, its unseen eyes fixed upon them. Daniel clenched his jaw, staring at the hooded figure. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge of panic beneath it. We don't have a choice, do we? Marcus wiped his forehead with a shaking hand. No, he glanced at the others, his face pale. We either go inside, or... His words trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all felt it. Whatever force had them in its grasp would not let them remain here. Sophia turned back to face the hooded monk. Her breath came in uneven bursts. Fine, she spat. You want us to go in? Then let's go. The monk took a slow step backward, vanishing beyond the doorway. The whispers surged forward, wrapping around them like unseen fingers tugging at their clothing. The invitation had become a command. One by one, they crossed the threshold. The moment their feet touched the ground beyond the doorway, the air shifted. It was colder here, much colder. Their breath fogged instantly, and an unnatural silence swallowed the sounds of their footsteps. The corridor stretched before them, impossibly long, lined with unlit iron sconces. The walls were covered in faded murals, depictions of religious scenes, but the faces of the figures had been defaced, scratched away, as though something had clawed at them with inhuman rage. Ethan lifted his broken camera, hesitating before pressing record despite the shattered lens. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else. If we get out of this, no one's going to believe it anyway. The corridor narrowed as they moved deeper, the ceiling pressing lower, the walls drawing closer together. The air smelled of damp stone and something older, something rotten. Then, all at once, the torches lining the walls flared to life. The fire burned an eerie blue, casting unnatural shadows that twisted and writhed. The murals, damaged as they were, seemed to shift under the flickering light. The faceless figures were moving. Olivia let out a strangled gasp. "Do you see that?" They all did. The figures in the murals weren't just shifting, they were turning their heads, staring, watching. And then, from deep within the corridor ahead, came a sound none of them would ever forget. A slow, dragging breath, and then another. Something else was here, waiting for them. The dragging breath pulsed through the corridor like a slow, rattling wind, each exhalation stretching the silence until it felt suffocating. The blue torchlight flickered as though in response, casting shifting shadows along the walls where the faceless figures continued their grotesque dance. Ethan tightened his grip on his broken camera, fingers trembling as he lifted it toward the source of the sound. Marcus took a hesitant step forward, his breath uneven. "We keep moving," he muttered, though the words felt more like a plea to himself than a directive for the group. No one disagreed. Each step felt heavier, the stone beneath them colder, as though they were sinking into the monastery itself. The air thickened, pressing against their skin like an unseen presence, and the whispering had not stopped. It had only changed. Now, the voices were speaking to them. Daniel was the first to react. He stumbled back suddenly, shaking his head as though trying to dislodge something from his ears. "Shut up, shut up." His voice was hoarse, desperate. "They're saying things. They know things." Sophia turned to him, eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" Daniel's breathing hitched. "They're whispering my name, saying things from when I was a kid, things I never told anyone." He looked at them with wild eyes, his face pale. How could they know that? Before anyone could answer, Olivia gasped. Her hands clutched at her temples, her eyes squeezing shut. "It's not just him," she choked out. "They're in my head too." Ethan's face darkened, and his stomach twisted. He strained to listen, not just to the voices, but to the silence beneath them. The heavy breathing, the presence ahead of them. It had gone quiet. Too quiet. Sophia, teeth clenched, turned toward Marcus. "What do we do?" Before he could answer, the blue flames overhead flickered violently, stretching unnaturally, their glow elongating until they pooled onto the floor like liquid fire. The light carved out an eerie path forward, illuminating a massive archway at the corridor's end. The whispering ceased. For a moment, the silence felt like a relief. Then they heard it. The breathing had moved. It was no longer ahead of them. It was behind them. Daniel turned first, and his breath caught in his throat. A shape loomed in the darkness, emerging from the corridor they had just walked through. It stood unnaturally tall, its robes heavier than those of the monk they had followed. But this one did not move like the first. It shuddered, twitched, and then it let out a single, slow exhale that rattled through their bones. The blue flames dimmed, casting everything into near darkness. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Run," he whispered. Then the figure lunged. The figure lunged, but not with the quickness of a living being. Its motion was jerky, as though it was caught between states, an apparition struggling to maintain its form, yet determined to reach them. The breath it exhaled rattled through the air, an echo of something far older than their understanding. For a split second, time seemed to stretch, the space between them and the creature expanding and contracting like a heartbeat. Then the reality of the situation slammed into them. Ethan, paralyzed by the sight of the creature's skeletal limbs and shadowed face, could only watch as it drew closer. It moved faster now, its limbs snapping into place as though it had remembered how to run. "Run!" Marcus's voice broke through the frozen moment. He was already sprinting, his feet pounding against the cold stone as he tore down the corridor. Sophia, already several paces behind him, snapped out of her daze. "Move!" she shouted, her voice frantic. The sound of the monk's breath, still behind them, still echoing, fueled her desperation. The rest of the group followed in frantic silence. Their footsteps echoed like thunder, the stone floors beneath them unforgiving, their hearts pounding in rhythm with their flight. Each footfall seemed to draw the creature closer, as though it thrived on their fear, as though it fed on their terror. Daniel stumbled, his foot catching on the uneven stone, but he didn't fall. His arms flailed, propelling him forward, but the air around him seemed to thicken, slowing him down. Olivia, just behind him, grabbed his arm, pulling him up, urging him on. "Don't look back," she gasped, her breath coming in jagged bursts. But it was too late. The monk had reached them. It was impossible to see clearly. The blue flames from the sconces were flickering wildly, casting shadows that danced and twisted, obscuring the shape of the thing behind them. The only thing they could hear now was its breath, deep and slow, as if it were savoring the chase. Sophia's voice broke through the chaos. "The door. We need to get to the door." Ahead of them, the archway loomed, a dark, yawning gap that promised a way out. The path to it was clear, but the oppressive air that surrounded them made it seem as though the distance was stretching, growing farther the harder they ran. Every step felt like they were sinking deeper into the stone, into the monastery itself. Marcus was the first to reach the archway. He threw himself toward it, his heart racing in his chest, his hands grasping at the stone as if he could claw his way to freedom. But just as he reached the edge of the archway, the creature's hands shot forward, its long fingers wrapping around his ankles with a force that made him cry out in pain. "Marcus!" Olivia screamed, her voice raw with terror. She reached out, but it was too late. The monk yanked him back into the dark, its chilling breath hissing in his ear as the shadowed form swallowed him whole. "No!" Ethan screamed, his feet sliding to a halt. The sight of Marcus being dragged back into the dark froze him in place. Sophia didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him forward again. "We don't stop." They couldn't stop. They couldn't risk looking back again. Together, the remaining group ran into the archway. But the moment they crossed the threshold, the floor beneath their feet gave way. A deep, groaning sound echoed, and the ground split apart. Ethan, Olivia, and Sophia teetered on the edge of a deep chasm that seemed to open up beneath them, an abyss that stretched down into the unknown. Their breaths caught in their throats. There was no turning back now. The monk was no longer chasing them. They had entered its domain, and what lay ahead, what they had to face, was something even darker. The chasm before them yawned wide, its depths swallowed by darkness. The air felt thick, pressing down upon their shoulders with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting, perhaps for centuries, for them to step into its reach. Each breath they took seemed to reverberate in the hollow space around them, amplifying their fear. The chasm was no mere pit. It felt like a wound in the very fabric of the monastery, a gaping mouth ready to devour anything that dared venture too close. Sophia's hand trembled as it clutched the stone edge, her knuckles whitening with the effort to steady herself. "We need to get across," she whispered, as if speaking louder might summon something worse. Olivia looked down into the abyss, her heart racing. "What do we get across?" Her voice trembled, and she stepped back, instinctively drawing closer to Ethan. "There's no bridge, no way forward." Ethan's mind raced, trying to grasp at any shred of logic, but none of it made sense. The monastery had twisted itself around them, distorting reality, pulling them deeper into its heart. The feeling of being watched, of being trapped within something far older and more malevolent than they could comprehend, was suffocating. "We don't have a choice," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. He took a tentative step forward, his foot brushing against the stone, testing it. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and yet it held firm beneath him. It wasn't just the air around them that was unnerving. It was the very ground beneath their feet, as if the monastery itself had a life of its own. Sophia glanced at him, her face pale but determined. "We can't stand here forever. There's something on the other side. We have to find a way." Her words seemed to stir something within them. There was something beyond the chasm, something they had to reach. They could all feel it now, the pull. Without another word, Ethan stepped further into the darkened space, leading the way as they moved closer to the precipice. He glanced back at the others, his heart hammering in his chest. The air was growing colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen with every step. A low, unnatural hum began to rise from the depths of the chasm, a sound that was neither mechanical nor human, but something in between, something ancient and hungry. Olivia flinched, her eyes darting around, as if expecting to see something emerge from the darkness. "I don't like this," Daniel muttered, the first to break the silence. His voice was tight with anxiety. "What's that sound?" It was then that they noticed it. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. The flicker of lights far below, barely visible like distant stars in the night sky. It was as if something or someone was waiting down there. The lights flickered again, and then the hum deepened, vibrating through their bones. Sophia stepped closer to the edge, her gaze drawn to the flickering lights. "It's not just the monastery, it's something else," she murmured. Her voice trembled. "I think they want us to come down." "No," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the tremor that had begun to creep into his chest. "We can't just jump down into that, whatever that is. We need another way." His words felt weak even as he said them. The longer they stood here, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. They could feel the weight of it pressing on their shoulders, like invisible hands reaching out from the chasm below, urging them to descend into the unknown. A loud crack echoed behind them. They all spun around, hearts racing. The monk, the same one that had pursued them earlier, was back. But this time it was different. The figure was no longer bound by the rules of human motion. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, as though they were made of something far more sinister than flesh and bone. Its head tilted, as though it were studying them, and the blue flames from the sconces above flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The monk raised a bony hand, pointing toward the chasm. Its breath, slow and deliberate, sounded like a command. "You must descend," it seemed to whisper in the air, though the words were more felt than heard. Sophia, her face ashen, turned to Ethan. "What do we do now?" she asked, voice shaking. Ethan's mind reeled. There was no escaping the pull of the chasm now. The creature was insistent. The pressure of the monastery was unrelenting. Their only choice, it seemed, was to face the unknown darkness below them, even as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, warning them of the path they were about to take. With no time left to second guess, Ethan nodded grimly. "We descend." The moment they made the decision to descend into the chasm, a deafening silence settled over them. It was as if the entire monastery was holding its breath, waiting. Every muscle in Ethan's body tensed, his legs unsteady beneath him as he peered into the black void below. The air had become suffocatingly thick, a heavy, viscous substance that made it feel like every step downward was a battle against gravity itself. The walls of the chasm, once seemingly infinite, now seemed to close in on them with each passing second. "There's no turning back now," Olivia muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked to Ethan for reassurance, but her face was pale, eyes wide with terror. "What are we walking into?" Ethan swallowed, but his throat was dry. "I don't know." The words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of their terror. He took a tentative step forward, feeling the rock crumble underfoot like brittle bone. The descent was steep and uneven, the walls slick with a wetness that was not quite water. It was more like the residue of something that had been festering in the depths of the earth for centuries, something ancient, something alive. The others followed behind him, their breaths quick and shallow, eyes darting around as though they could somehow escape the terrifying pull of the chasm. They were all aware that they were stepping into a place where no one had ventured before, and the weight of that knowledge settled like a stone in their stomachs. As they descended further, the flickering lights below grew brighter, though the source remained unseen. The hum they had heard earlier was louder now, reverberating through their bones, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The air was thick with dread, and every instinct in Ethan screamed for them to turn back. But they couldn't. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to the answers they sought. "How much further?" Daniel asked, his voice strained with anxiety. His face was etched with the same fear that gripped the others. The climb seemed endless, as though the chasm stretched downward infinitely, as though it were pulling them deeper into the heart of the monastery, and into the heart of something far more sinister. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice tight. His words hung in the air like a curse. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to let fear take hold. There was no escape from the path they had chosen. Suddenly, a strange sensation washed over him, a cold, crawling feeling that skittered up his spine and settled into his chest. It was as if the walls of the chasm were alive, as though they were breathing, pulsing with something dark and malignant. The hum from below intensified, its frequency rising until it became a maddening pitch that made his head ache. Sophia staggered, her hand flying to her head. It's getting harder to think. The noise, she trailed off, her voice strained, and Ethan turned to see her eyes glazed over, as though she were no longer fully present. The hum, the vibration, it was doing something to them. It was driving them mad. "We have to keep moving," Ethan said through gritted teeth. He reached out, grabbing Sophia by the shoulder and shaking her gently. "Focus. Stay with us." Sophia blinked rapidly, her gaze slowly focusing on him. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. The sound, She broke off again, but this time she took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm fine now." The group pressed on, but the further they went, the more the air seemed to shift. It wasn't just the vibrations. The stone underfoot felt more unstable, as if the very foundation of the monastery was shifting beneath them. The walls themselves seemed to stretch and pulse, warping in unnatural ways. Ethan could have sworn that for a moment, just a flicker of a second, the rocks themselves had seemed to writhe like something alive, something not of this world. The lights from below continued to flicker, now pulsing erratically, and it wasn't long before they reached the bottom. The floor was damp and uneven, and the air was thick with a smell that reminded Ethan of something long decayed. The chasm opened into a vast chamber, the size of which was impossible to gauge in the dim, flickering light. The stone walls seemed to rise infinitely, disappearing into a black sky that had no stars, no horizon, just endless, oppressive dark. There, in the center of the chamber, stood an altar, tall, ancient, and covered in strange, cryptic symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as though alive. The altar radiated a sickly, otherworldly glow, and the hum that had been building in their heads since the moment they began their descent, was now deafening. It was the sound of something long forgotten, something that should never have been awakened. Ethan stepped forward, his legs shaking, but something stopped him. There was a presence here, an intelligence that he could feel pressing against him, suffocating him. It wasn't just the air, it was the room itself. The walls, the altar, the ground beneath them. All of it seemed to be alive, as though it had been waiting for their arrival. And as Ethan stood there, the realization hit him like a thunderclap. They hadn't just stumbled upon this place. They had been drawn here. This was never a choice, he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the others heard it. They all turned to look at him, their faces etched with confusion, fear. "No," Daniel said, shaking his head. "What do you mean? What are you?" But Ethan couldn't answer. The words seemed to get stuck in his throat as the realization fully sank in. Whatever force had brought them here, it was not something they could fight, not something they could escape. They had reached the very heart of the monastery, and whatever lay ahead was not something of this world. They were here to fulfill a purpose, but what that purpose was, Ethan couldn't yet comprehend. All he knew was that the darkness they had descended into was only the beginning. As the group stood in the chamber, surrounded by the oppressive hum of the unseen force, it became clear to Ethan that they had crossed a threshold. The air seemed to grow colder, and the oppressive darkness settled deeper around them, closing in like an ancient, unrelenting fist. They had reached the heart of the monastery, but it felt as though the monastery itself had begun to respond to their presence. The very walls seemed to lean in, as if listening, watching, waiting. The altar, standing in the center of the chamber, pulsed with an otherworldly glow. The cryptic symbols etched into its surface twisted unnaturally, as if alive, shifting with a rhythm that did not belong to the natural world. Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from the altar, despite every instinct in his body telling him to look away. Something about it felt wrong, like it held secrets, dark, terrible secrets, that were never meant to be uncovered. "Do you see that?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. She had taken a step forward, drawn to the altar as though some invisible force was guiding her. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "Those symbols, they're moving." Ethan nodded grimly, his gaze still fixed on the altar. "I see it, and I don't think it's good." The hum, once a subtle vibration in the background, now vibrated with a dreadful intensity. It was no longer just in their ears. It was in their bones, in their minds, a sound that reverberated through the very core of their beings. It felt as though it was trying to pull them apart, piece by piece, unraveling their sense of reality. "What is this place?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. He, too, had taken a cautious step toward the altar, as if it was the only thing that mattered in the room. His eyes were unfocused, glazed with an unsettling, almost hypnotic sheen. Ethan wanted to reach out to him, but his legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice tight with fear. He felt a cold sweat breaking out on his skin as the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. Something was wrong here. The monastery, the chasm, they were all part of something ancient, something powerful. And whatever that was, it was alive. Suddenly, there was a sound, a rustling in the shadows, a scraping sound like bones being dragged across the stone floor. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the growing hum, but it grew louder, closer, as though something was coming for them. Ethan's heart raced as he turned toward the sound, but there was nothing in the chamber but them and the altar. Yet he could feel it, the presence. It was there, in the dark, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. "Did you hear that?" Olivia's voice cracked, her face turning pale as she searched the room. Something's here." Before Ethan could respond, a figure stepped into the dim light cast by the altar. It was cloaked in tattered robes, its face obscured by a hood. The figure moved with an unsettling grace, gliding rather than walking, its steps silent against the stone floor. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure stopped in front of the altar, its presence suffocating the air around them. Ethan could hear the faint sound of breathing, ragged and shallow, coming from within the hood. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo through the very fabric of the chamber, the figure spoke. "Why have you come?" The voice was low, rough, like the scraping of stone against stone. It was not a question, it was a command. Ethan's mind raced, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He was paralyzed, caught between the terror of what he was seeing and the overwhelming desire to flee. But they were trapped. There was nowhere to go. He forced the words out, though they felt alien on his tongue. We didn't mean to," he stammered, his throat dry. We were just looking for answers. We didn't know." The figure let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. It raised a skeletal hand, and the air grew colder still. "Answers? Foolish mortals always seek answers where they should not." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if contemplating them. "You think you're the first to come here? You think you are the first to seek the truth?" Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried to step back, but his legs were unresponsive, weighed down by some invisible force. The others were frozen as well, their eyes wide in terror, unable to tear their gaze away from the figure before them. It was as though some unseen hand had seized them, rooting them to the spot. The figure's voice grew darker, more ominous. "This place was never meant for your kind. You are trespassers in a realm that should have remained forgotten." It stepped closer, its skeletal face still hidden beneath the hood. "The monks who built this place, they were not like you. They were not human. They were something else entirely." They came seeking power, seeking immortality. But they paid the price for their arrogance. The figure's words were like ice, chilling Ethan to the core. The monks, those spectral figures they had seen in the halls above, they weren't just spirits. They were the remnants of something far darker. Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what the figure was saying. "You must leave," the figure hissed. "Leave before it's too late." And then, as if sensing their hesitation, it raised its arms. The air around them seemed to warp and distort, and the walls of the chamber trembled, as though the very foundation of the monastery was shaking under the weight of an ancient power. But the figure did not attack. Instead, it backed away, disappearing into the shadows from which it had emerged. As it retreated, Ethan's mind reeled, his thoughts spinning wildly. What had just happened? Was it a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? In that moment, the hum that filled the air grew louder, its frequency shifting, becoming almost unbearable. The chamber seemed to collapse inward, the walls pulsing with a sinister rhythm. And yet, despite the overwhelming sensation of dread, there was a sense of inevitability. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The forgotten monks, the truth behind the altar, it was all connected, and there was no turning back now. The oppressive darkness of the monastery seemed to deepen with every passing moment. After the encounter with the cloaked figure, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The air was thick, charged with a sense of impending doom, and the very walls seemed to groan under the weight of some ancient, unknowable force. It was as though the monastery itself was alive, its breath coming in cold, shuddering waves. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure had warned them to leave, but how could they? They were already in too deep. Whatever dark history lay hidden beneath the stones of this place, it was clear now that they were part of it, woven into its fabric in ways they didn't yet understand. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an energy that felt unnatural, as though the monastery itself was drawing them in, slowly but relentlessly. "We need to get out of here," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible over the humming that now filled the chamber. Her wide eyes flicked nervously around the room, as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. But there was no sign of it, just the echo of its words lingering in the air like a curse. Daniel, however, did not share Olivia's fear. His eyes were glassy, his expression distant, as though he were lost in thought. He had not said a word since the figure's departure, and his silence was beginning to worry Ethan. There was something wrong with him. Something about the encounter had affected him deeply, perhaps more than he was willing to admit. Ethan opened his mouth to speak to him, but before he could say anything, Daniel turned to him, his voice low, almost too calm. "We can't leave," Daniel said, his tone almost detached. "Not yet. Not until we know the truth." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Ethan stared at his friend, trying to make sense of what he had just said. Daniel had always been the rational one, the skeptic, the one who would dismiss any notion of the supernatural without a second thought. Yet now, there was an unshakable conviction in his voice, a sense of determination that unnerved Ethan. "We've seen enough," Ethan replied, his voice strained. "We've seen enough to know that whatever's happening here, it's not something we can control. We need to get out, Daniel." But Daniel shook his head, his eyes darkening with a look that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "No, I need to understand. The monks, the altar, there's something about this place. It's not just haunted, Ethan. It's something more, something ancient." Olivia stepped forward, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, as though trying to bring him back to reality. "You're not making sense," she said, her voice trembling. "We're not equipped to deal with whatever this is. We don't even know what it is." For a long moment, there was silence. The humming sound that had filled the air seemed to intensify, vibrating through the very bones of the monastery, as though it were calling to them. Ethan could feel his thoughts becoming muddled, his sense of reality slipping away. It was as if the monastery was exerting its influence on them, pushing them to stay, to dig deeper into its secrets. But why? What was the monastery trying to tell them? And why had they been chosen to uncover its truths? The ground beneath their feet shifted suddenly, jolting Ethan from his thoughts. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor that passed through the stone floor, but it was enough to send a ripple of fear through him. Something had changed. The monastery had responded to their presence once again, but this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like a warning. What was that? Olivia gasped, her hand gripping Ethan's arm in alarm. Did you feel that? Before Ethan could respond, a low rumble reverberated through the chamber. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the very air seemed to grow heavier. A figure appeared at the far end of the room, emerging from the shadows like a wraith, its form indistinct but unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. One of the spectral monks, its face obscured by the dark hood of its robes. The figure did not move, but its presence seemed to fill the entire space, suffocating the air around them. Ethan could feel his pulse quickening, his body instinctively reacting to the malevolent energy that radiated from a monk. The humming sound grew louder, more insistent, as though it were coming from the very bones of the creature before them. The monk raised its hand, and the chamber seemed to come alive. The symbols on the walls glowed with an eerie light, shifting and changing as though they were trying to communicate something to them. Something important, something urgent. But Ethan couldn't understand them. He couldn't make sense of the images flickering in front of him. The spectral monk's voice broke through the growing cacophony of sound, its words like an ancient incantation, reverberating through the chamber. "You have awakened us," it intoned, its voice cold and hollow. "You have disturbed the slumber of the forgotten." Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. The forgotten. The words rang in his mind, echoing like a warning. What had they uncovered here? What had they done by coming to this place? "You seek the truth," the monk continued, its voice low and steady. "But the truth is a burden few can bear. The monastery holds secrets that cannot be unlearned. The price for your knowledge will be great." Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts spinning wildly as he tried to process the monk's words. What was it talking about? What truth? What price? As if in response, the ground beneath them shook once again, this time with far more intensity. The air grew colder, and the chamber seemed to darken, as though the very light of the altar was being consumed by some unseen force. Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. Something was coming, something terrible. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the spectral monk vanished, fading into the shadows from which it had come. The humming ceased, and the room fell silent. But the silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than any sound ever could. The monastery had made its move. It had warned them, and now it seemed to be waiting for them to make theirs. Ethan turned to Daniel and Olivia, his voice shaky but resolute. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned toward the exit, the door slammed shut with a resounding bang, trapping them inside. The monastery was no longer just a place. It was a prison, and they were its unwilling guests. The atmosphere inside the monastery had shifted irreparably. No longer was it a mere haunted ruin. It had become something far more insidious. As the heavy door slammed shut behind them, Ethan felt the suffocating weight of confinement pressing down on him. They were trapped. The initial shock of being locked inside was quickly replaced by a creeping realization. This was no accident. This was deliberate. The monastery, or whatever force controlled it, had made its move. The moment they had crossed the line, had awakened the spirits that lingered, it had responded. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence was unbearable. Olivia clutched Ethan's arm, her breath shallow, as if she were trying to hold herself together. Daniel, however, stood in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the now-closed door as if he were willing it to open, though he knew it was useless. The same strange, detached expression was still on his face, but it was now mingled with a sense of uncertainty. Whatever clarity he had had before was slipping away, replaced by something darker, something that Ethan couldn't quite place. "How could they lock us in?" Olivia finally whispered, her voice trembling with fear and disbelief. "How? What is this place?" Ethan glanced at her, his mind spinning. "I don't know. But I'm starting to think we're not just dealing with ghosts. This place, it's alive, and it's keeping us here for a reason. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached their ears, a low creaking, like the groan of wood or stone under pressure. It seemed to come from all around them, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Then, a shuffling noise, followed by a faint, raspy whispering. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. It was as though the monastery itself was waking up, stirring with malicious intent. Something was watching them. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end of the chamber, its shape distorted by the low light filtering through the cracks in the stone walls. The same spectral monk from earlier materialized, but this time, its presence was more tangible, more oppressive. The monk's face was hidden in shadow, but it had seemed to be moving slightly, as though something was shifting beneath it. "You should not have come." The monk's voice echoed through the chamber, its tone colder than before. The words cut through the thick silence like a blade, and Ethan's stomach twisted in response. "You have disturbed what was meant to be forgotten. The price for this awakening is steep." Daniel, still fixated on the figure, stepped forward, his eyes glazed over. "What do you want from us?" His voice was low and measured, almost as if he were talking to an old acquaintance rather than an apparition. It was unsettling to Ethan, who could feel the very air around them grow colder with each passing moment. The monk did not respond immediately. Instead, it seemed to consider Daniel's words, its form wavering slightly in the dim light. "The monastery is a prison," it said finally. "Not for you, but for something far older. It has waited for centuries. Now it calls to you. It has already begun to take hold." The monk raised its hand, and the walls trembled in response, as though something beneath the stone was waking from a deep slumber. Ethan's pulse quickened. Whatever this thing was, whether it was a spirit, a demon, or something else entirely, it was not simply warning them. It was mocking them. "What is it?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling with desperation. "What's been locked away in this place?" The monk's voice lowered, becoming almost a whisper. "It is not for you to know. You are merely the messengers. The harbingers." The words hit Ethan like a blow. Harbingers. Was the monk telling them that they were part of something much larger than they could have ever imagined? Were they part of some ancient prophecy or ritual that had led them to this very moment? Or was it all just a trick, another game the monastery was playing with their minds? Suddenly, the monk extended its arm, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Ethan's breath came out in visible puffs as he shivered uncontrollably. His skin crawled, his very instincts screaming at him to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in on them, and the monk's form began to distort, its shadow growing larger until it seemed to consume the entire room. "You have no choice," the monk continued, its voice now an echo in the vast, empty space. "The door will not open until you understand. You must uncover the truth of this place. You must witness the horrors it holds, and only then will you be free." The room grew darker, the shadows stretching out toward them, suffocating them. Ethan felt as though the very air was alive, pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. His mind raced. How could they escape this nightmare? What was the truth they needed to uncover? The monk's words echoed in his ears, but they made no sense. They were trapped in a prison, but the key was somewhere within this very monastery. The price for freedom was to face whatever horrors it had concealed for so long. As the monk began to fade, its presence lingering like a dark cloud, Ethan's mind began to churn. He had to keep his focus. They had to find a way out. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the monastery was not simply trapping them. It was trying to break them, to twist their perceptions of reality until they no longer knew what was true. In the midst of this growing madness, Olivia's voice pierced through the suffocating silence. "Look, the floor," she screamed. Ethan's gaze snapped downward, and his stomach churned. The stone beneath their feet was cracking, faint lines spreading outward like the veins of some monstrous creature. Through the cracks, something dark and ominous began to rise. It was slow at first, just a trickle of shadow, but then it began to crawl, slithering across the floor like liquid darkness. Daniel stepped forward, almost hypnotically, his eyes locked on the growing shadow. "It's coming," he murmured. "It's coming for us." Ethan felt his throat tighten as the shadow spread faster, filling the room with a thick, suffocating fog. The very air tasted of decay, of something ancient and putrid. They had awoken something, and now it was coming for them. The monastery had made its move. There was no turning back. The darkness that enveloped them was unlike any they had encountered before. It was not merely an absence of light. It was a living, breathing entity that seemed to pulse and writhe in the corners of the monastery's chamber. Ethan felt it pressing down on his chest, a suffocating weight that made every breath feel like an insurmountable task. The shadow that had spread across the floor was no longer a trickle. It was alive, a creeping black mass that coiled around their legs like serpents, its cold tendrils tightening with each passing second. The air was thick, so dense that it felt as though they were walking underwater, each step an immense effort. But it wasn't just the shadow that held them captive. The entire room seemed to be alive now, shifting and changing around them. The walls that once seemed solid began to groan, their surfaces warping as though they were made of soft clay. The very stones under their feet seemed to shiver in the oppressive atmosphere. Time itself felt like it was being stretched and compressed, each moment blending into the next until Ethan couldn't tell whether they had been standing there for minutes or hours. The monastery's grip on them had tightened, and it was now a prison that bent the laws of nature. "Where are we?" Olivia's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected something to jump out from the shadows at any moment. Her body was trembling, and Ethan could see the desperation in her eyes. She was no longer the calm, rational woman he had come to rely on. The fear had broken her, just as it was breaking them all. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but found that his throat had gone dry. The words caught in his chest, stuck there like a lump of ice. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what was happening to them, what had taken hold of the monastery. The monk had spoken of truths to be uncovered, of horrors to be witnessed, but none of it made sense. There was no clarity, only chaos. "We need to get out of here," Daniel said, his voice distant and almost mechanical. He was standing at the center of the room, his gaze locked on a far corner where the shadow seemed to swirl in a vortex. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Daniel had always been the skeptical one, the rational one, but now he was speaking in a tone that bordered on hysteria. There was no doubt in Ethan's mind now. The monastery had broken them, but it wasn't just the place that was breaking them. Ethan could feel something else, something inside him, something primal that was awakening in response to the terror around them. It was as though the darkness was pulling at something deep within, something buried beneath years of normalcy. The monastery had found their fears and was amplifying them, twisting their minds in ways they couldn't understand. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The floor beneath their feet shifted, sending a shockwave through the room. Ethan staggered, barely catching himself against one of the stone walls. The rumbling grew louder, and then, with a violent crack, the floor split wide open. A fissure ran across the room, dividing it in two, and from the depths of the chasm, an eerie light began to glow. "What is that?" Olivia gasped, her voice thick with terror. Ethan didn't need to answer. They all saw it. Slowly rising from the depths of the fissure was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, draped in tattered robes that fluttered in the unnatural wind that had begun to whip around them. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but from beneath it, two glowing eyes stared back at them. The eyes were empty, devoid of emotion, but they seemed to pierce into Ethan's soul. "Is that," Daniel began, his voice faltering, "one of them?" Ethan couldn't respond. He was rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt as though he were staring into the abyss itself, and it was staring back, waiting for him to make a move. The figure began to move slowly, its long limbs jerking unnaturally as it rose higher and higher from the chasm. It wasn't walking, it was gliding as though it were floating above the floor, its movements erratic and inhuman. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. The cold seeped into Ethan's bones, numbing his senses. He tried to speak, to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure was closer now, its glowing eyes fixed on him. He could feel it, whatever it was, reaching out, pulling at him with an invisible force. He wanted to look away, to turn and run, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey. "Don't look away," the figure said, its voice a hollow whisper that seemed to come from all around them. It wasn't speaking to them directly, but to something deeper, something primal within their minds. Ethan could feel the words cutting through him, worming their way into his thoughts. The figure continued its slow, deliberate advance, the shadows around it growing darker, thicker. It was pulling the darkness with it, feeding off it, as though it were one with the very essence of the monastery. Ethan's mind raced. What was it? What did it want from them? "I know what you're thinking," the figure said, its voice impossibly close now. "You think you can escape, but there is nowhere to go. You are here because you belong here. You are bound to this place, just as we are." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. What did it mean? Were they trapped here forever? He didn't know, but he felt a growing sense of dread. This was no ordinary ghost, no spirit haunting a building. It was something far older, something tied to the very foundation of the monastery itself. As the figure came within arm's reach, it raised a hand, and the shadows around them seemed to pulse in response, as though they were alive. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and Ethan felt as though he were suffocating. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. His limbs grew heavy, as though the weight of the darkness itself was pressing down on him, keeping him rooted in place. Then, in an instant, the figure disappeared, melting back into the shadows from which it came. The chasm in the floor sealed itself with an earth-shaking rumble, and the room returned to its eerie silence. But the presence remained. It was still there, lurking in the corners of Ethan's mind, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Ethan staggered back, gasping for breath. His heart raced in his chest, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. What was that thing? What did it mean when it said they belonged here? Was the monastery trying to claim them? Was this its true purpose, to turn them into one of the Silent Ones? The question lingered in the air, unanswered and haunting. Ethan's mind spun as he tried to make sense of what had just occurred. The figure, the Silent One, had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but its presence was still felt in the air, as though the very walls of the monastery were alive with its lingering influence. The shadows seemed thicker now, more oppressive, pressing against them like an unseen weight. Every corner of the room held the promise of more horror, and yet, as they stood in the aftershock of the encounter, there was a profound silence, a chilling quiet that seemed to deepen the darkness. The words of the figure echoed in Ethan's mind. "You belong here. Is anyone else seeing this?" Daniel's voice broke the silence, shaking with disbelief. He turned to the others, his eyes wide with fear, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. That thing wasn't human. Olivia nodded, her face pale, her eyes distant. It was something more. It knew what we were thinking. It knew us. Ethan could only nod. The encounter had shattered his grip on reality. He had believed that there was some rational explanation for everything they had witnessed. The whispers, the shadows, the spectral monks. But that figure was beyond reason. It was a manifestation of something far older, something that transcended the physical world. He could feel it in his bones now. They were not merely exploring a haunted building. They were entangled in something far more sinister. But what was it? What was the true nature of the monastery, and why had it drawn them here? They had come to the monastery with the intention of uncovering its secrets. But with each passing hour, the lines between the past and present seemed to blur. The monastery, once an isolated relic of a forgotten time, had become a living nightmare. It was as though the place itself was a manifestation of the darkness that had taken root in their minds, drawing them deeper into its web with each new revelation. "Do you think we can leave?" Olivia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Can we even escape from here?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. The question had gnawed at him ever since they had entered the monastery, but after what they had just experienced, he wasn't sure what the answer was. It was becoming clear to him that the monastery wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, a place where time and space bent and twisted in unnatural ways. They had no idea how long they had been there or what had happened to the outside world. It was as if they had been cut off from everything. "We have to find a way out," Daniel said, his voice now firm, though there was a tremor in his hands as he clenched them into fists. "This place, it's not real. It's just some twisted illusion. We have to break it." Ethan glanced at Daniel. The words sounded hollow, even to him. It was one thing to think they could escape this nightmare, but the reality was far more complex. The more they tried to fight it, the more it seemed to tighten its grip. It was almost as if the monastery fed off their fear, feeding the shadows, deepening the mystery. Every attempt to leave only drew them deeper into the darkness. As they moved through the monastery, the sense of disorientation grew. The corridors they had traversed earlier seemed to have changed. The walls, once cold stone, now appeared soft and fluid, as though they were being consumed by an invisible force. The air, once thick with dust, was now musty, damp, suffocating. The sounds that had once been faint whispers were now growing louder, more distinct, like voices murmuring just beyond their hearing. The air itself seemed to vibrate with unseen energy, crackling with malevolent intent. "I don't understand," Olivia muttered, almost to herself. "How could this place be like this? It's supposed to be abandoned. There's no way it's still standing after all these years." Ethan turned to her, his expression grim. "It's not abandoned. It's alive." Those words hung in the air, settling heavily between them. The monastery wasn't just a relic of the past. It was an entity unto itself, a place of power that had survived for centuries. But what kind of power was it? What was the true nature of the spirits that inhabited it, and why had they come? It was as though the monastery had been waiting for them, calling them to its decaying halls, leading them into its dark heart. As they moved deeper, they stumbled upon a room they had not seen before. The door, made of thick, warped wood, seemed to materialize out of nowhere. It opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the halls, reverberating in the silence that surrounded them. The room inside was unlike any they had encountered. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their meanings inscrutable. But it wasn't the symbols that caught Ethan's attention. It was the altar at the center of the room. The altar was surrounded by shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse, almost as though they had a life of their own. The stone slab at its center was carved with intricate patterns, and beneath it, there was a dark stain that Ethan couldn't quite place. The room itself felt cold, unnaturally cold, as though it were somehow separate from the rest of the monastery. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. "You've come," it said. "You've come to witness what cannot be understood." The voice was low, deep, and impossible to place. It seemed to echo from all corners of the room, reverberating in Ethan's mind. The shadows around them seemed to grow longer, their edges becoming sharper, more defined. It was the same presence they had felt earlier, the silent one, or perhaps something worse. The voice was coming from the very walls of the room, as if the monastery itself had spoken. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped forward, drawn to the altar. He knew that whatever this place was, it was the key to everything. But what truth would they uncover? What price would they have to pay for it? The shadows seemed to beckon them closer, promising answers. But Ethan knew, deep down, that some truths were too dangerous to uncover. Yet, there was no turning back now. The monastery had them in its grip, and its mysteries were about to be revealed, whether they were ready for them or not. As Ethan stood before the altar, a strange sense of inevitability washed over him. The room, cold and silent, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to make his next move. The shadows around the altar shifted and swirled, reacting to his every movement, and the air grew thick, as if the space itself had become heavier with every passing second. He could feel the weight of the unseen eyes upon him, the presence of the monks, or whatever dark force haunted the monastery, pressing closer. "What is this place?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible, as though the very walls of the room could hear him. He, too, was drawn to the altar, but the hesitation in his steps suggested a deep fear that had begun to grow in him, a fear that had only intensified since their encounter with the Silent One. Olivia stood to the side, her face pale and strained. She seemed less interested in the altar than in the strange markings on the walls. These symbols, they're not just decorative. They're instructions, rituals, something ancient. Whatever this place is, it's not just haunted. It's a gateway. Ethan turned to look at Olivia. A gateway? A gateway to what? Olivia shook her head, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not something we should be messing with. I think it's been waiting for us. The truth of her words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. As Ethan turned back to the altar, he realized that Olivia's intuition was more accurate than he had hoped. The monastery had not just drawn them in by accident. It had been guiding them, preparing them for something. But for what? What was the true purpose of their arrival? And more importantly, why had they been chosen to uncover its secrets? He could no longer ignore the overwhelming pull of the altar. Something about it felt familiar, as though it were calling to him personally, as though it knew him. He hesitated, then moved forward, drawn by an invisible force. His hands trembled as they reached for the ancient stone slab. The patterns carved into it were strange and unnerving, twisting in ways that defied logic. But there was no mistaking the feeling that it was alive, that the altar itself was a part of the monastery's ancient power. As his fingertips brushed against the surface of the altar, the room seemed to exhale. The shadows that had gathered around them shifted violently, as though they had come alive, reacting to his touch. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw something in the darkness beyond the altar, just at the edge of his vision. A figure, tall and cloaked, standing silently, watching them. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The room was still once more, but the weight of its presence lingered, thick and suffocating. The air felt charged, and Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. "What was that?" Daniel asked, his voice quivering. "Did you see it? Did you see something?" Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "Yes, but it was just a shadow. It's not real." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. It was real, and it had been watching them. The monastery's ancient inhabitants, or whatever force had bound them to this place, were no longer content with simply being observers. They were active, moving among the living once more. And they weren't interested in letting the intruders, Ethan and his companions, leave. As the group stood in silence, trying to process what had just occurred, a low rumble seemed to reverberate through the floor beneath their feet. The stone altar trembled, and a faint glow, pale and sickly, began to emanate from the cracks in the stone. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a glimmer of light, but quickly grew brighter, casting strange reflections on the walls around them. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "It's happening. The ritual is starting." "What ritual?" Ethan asked, his mind racing as he stepped back from the altar. The glow from the stone intensified, and for a brief moment, he saw shapes, figures, moving behind the light, their outlines barely discernible in the brilliance. "The one that was meant to bind us here," Olivia said, her voice tight with fear. "The one that draws the souls of the living into this place and traps them. We weren't supposed to be here, Ethan. We weren't meant to uncover the truth. But now it's too late." The rumbling beneath their feet grew louder, and Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, as if the monastery itself were awakening. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing the space around them, and the air turned thick with a sense of impending doom. The symbols on the walls began to glow, flickering in time with the altar's illumination, and Ethan realized with a chilling certainty that the very fabric of reality was starting to fray, unraveling as the power of the monastery surged to life. The monks' spectral figures began to reappear, their faces hidden behind hoods, their bodies cloaked in the tattered remnants of their former lives. They moved in silent procession, circling the altar, their movements eerily synchronized. The sounds of chanting began to fill the air, low and guttural, the words unintelligible but undeniably familiar. The monks were invoking something ancient and terrible. As the chanting grew louder, the walls seemed to pulse with energy. The room, once confined, now felt as though it were stretching, bending, twisting into another dimension. The altar's glow intensified, bathing the room in a sickly light. Ethan's head swam, and he staggered backward, struggling to maintain his footing. "We have to stop this," Daniel gasped, his voice shaking with panic. "We have to do something." But Ethan could only watch as the room continued to warp, his thoughts swirling in a fog of terror. Whatever was happening, whatever dark power was being awakened, it was beyond their control. They were no longer mere observers. They had become part of the ritual, part of the unholy design of the monastery. The walls trembled once more, and then, in a sudden, terrifying flash of light, the chanting ceased. The room fell silent, and in that silence, Ethan felt the cold grip of dread settle deep within him. The monks were gone, but something else had taken their place. A presence, darker and more malevolent than anything they had encountered before, had entered the room, and it was waiting. The silence that followed the monk's disappearance was suffocating. Ethan stood frozen, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation, as though the very air had become heavier, pressing down on him from all sides. The room, once filled with the unsettling glow of the altar, now felt like a tomb, dark and suffocating. It was as though whatever presence had taken the place of the monks was now studying them, watching their every move with an intensity that threatened to crush their spirits. Daniel, who had been standing closest to Ethan, broke the silence with a barely audible whisper. "What is it? What's happening? Where did they go?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but found that no words came. His throat was dry, his mind a whirlpool of confusion. The monks had vanished, and in their place, a new, more terrifying presence had made itself known. It wasn't just the absence of the monks that troubled him. It was the sense of something ancient, something vast, that now occupied the space. It felt like the room itself had become a living entity, breathing in time with their own rapid heartbeats. Olivia, standing off to the side, seemed to have noticed the same shift in the atmosphere. Her eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. "It's not just the monks anymore," she said in a strained voice, her words breaking through the thick silence. "It's something worse." Ethan turned his gaze to her, his eyes desperate for answers. "What do you mean? What is it?" But before Olivia could respond, a low rumble echoed through the walls, followed by a piercing, high-pitched sound that made their ears ache. The ground beneath their feet vibrated as though something massive was stirring, rising from the depths of the monastery itself. Ethan's stomach churned as a voice, cold and distant, began to fill the room. A voice not heard with the ears but felt deep within the mind. "You should not have come." The voice intoned, its tone filled with ancient authority. "You have disturbed the balance. Now, you must pay the price." The words reverberated in Ethan's mind, as though they were etched into his very soul. The voice was not a physical one, but it carried a weight of power that made his limbs grow heavy, his thoughts clouded. He could feel the presence growing stronger, pressing against him from all sides. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and he could hear the distant sound of something crawling beneath the floorboards, scratching at the edges of reality. Ethan turned to look at his companions, his gaze meeting Daniel's fearful eyes. "What do we do?" Daniel's voice was trembling, his body shaking with terror, but there was no answer. How could they fight something that was beyond understanding, beyond their control? Olivia, however, did not seem as paralyzed by fear. She stepped forward, her face set with determination. "We have to find the source of this power," she said, her voice steady, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her. "There has to be a way to stop it. There has to be a way to sever the connection." Ethan's mind raced as he considered Olivia's words. The power they were facing was not something that could be fought in the conventional sense. It wasn't a creature that could be slain, nor a force that could be destroyed with simple means. It was something far older, far more terrifying. But if there was one thing that could end this, it was the source, the heart of the darkness that had been festering within the monastery for centuries. The rumbling beneath their feet intensified, growing louder with each passing moment. Ethan could feel the temperature in the room drop sharply, and he saw his breath mist in the air. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, curling around the edges like tendrils, and the faint glow from the altar grew dim, flickering like a dying flame. "We have to find it," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. "We have to find the source of all this." Olivia nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "The altar. It's the focal point. We need to return there, see if we can find something, anything that can stop this." But as they moved toward the altar, the floor beneath them cracked, splitting wide open. A dark, swirling vortex appeared, its edges jagged and sharp, a rift into something far darker than anything they had encountered so far. The very air around it seemed to scream with the weight of an ancient curse, and the presence that had once felt distant now surged forward, as though it were emerging from the depths of the abyss itself. The voice echoed again, this time louder, more insistent. "You are too late. The ritual has begun. There is no stopping it now." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the rift expanded, swallowing the light in the room, plunging them into darkness. He felt the pull of the vortex, an insatiable force tugging at him, trying to drag him in. But he resisted, forcing himself to stay grounded. He had to find a way to end this, before the monastery's dark power consumed them all. Suddenly, the rift snapped shut with a deafening crash, and the room fell silent again. The oppressive weight that had filled the space was gone, and for a moment, Ethan dared to believe that they had succeeded. But then he saw it. The altar had changed. The once stone surface was now slick and wet, as though it had been bathed in blood. And there, at the center, was a single, pulsing red gem. It glowed with an unnatural light, casting eerie shadows across the room. The voice, now tinged with amusement, whispered, "The final key is before you. But do you have the courage to claim it?" Ethan stepped forward, his breath shallow, his body trembling. He knew what he had to do. The gem was the source. But what would happen when he touched it? Would it sever the bond, or would it unleash something far worse? As his hand hovered over the gem, a deep, primal fear gripped him. This was the moment of truth, the moment when everything would be decided. Would he have the courage to destroy the source? Or would he fall victim to the same darkness that had claimed so many before him? The decision, it seemed, was not his to make. The altar responded to his touch before he could fully make up his mind, and the room erupted into chaos. The ground cracked open once more, and the shadows surged forward, drowning him in a flood of darkness. The darkness that enveloped Ethan was suffocating, a tangible force pressing against him from all sides. His mind struggled to process what was happening, as the shadows seemed to close in, twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. His senses, already dulled by exhaustion, were overwhelmed by the relentless pull of the void. There was no sound, no light, only a deep, profound silence, as though the world itself had stopped turning. The last thing he remembered was his hand nearing the red gem on the altar, but beyond that, everything blurred into a hazy fog of uncertainty. Time felt irrelevant in the void. Ethan's perception of it fractured, the moments stretching and contracting in bizarre, unpredictable patterns. He felt as though he was being pulled in every direction at once, each tug pulling him deeper into the abyss. But then, as if from a great distance, a single thought pierced through the oppressive darkness. Is this the end? The thought was a chilling one. Was this the final fate of all who had stepped into the monastery? Had they become lost to the same forces that had consumed the monks centuries ago? Or was there still a chance to escape, to find a way out before the darkness claimed them as its own? Ethan fought to concentrate, forcing his mind to focus. There had to be a way out. He had come this far, faced so many horrors. He couldn't let it all end here. And then, As though in response to his will, the darkness began to shift. At first, it was a mere whisper, a flicker of movement at the edges of his vision. But then it grew, slowly at first, but quickly picking up speed, until the shadows no longer surrounded him, but seemed to pull away. The oppressive weight lifted, and a single, sharp light pierced the gloom, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Ethan's heart raced, and he reached out instinctively, grasping at the light. The world around him seemed to shift once more, and suddenly he was standing on solid ground, bathed in the glow of an ethereal light. His surroundings were unfamiliar. He was no longer in the monastery, or at least not the same monastery he had known. The air was different, still cold, but with an almost metallic tang to it. The architecture around him was unlike anything he had seen before. Strange, geometrical patterns that seemed to pulse with life, their surfaces shifting and changing as if they were made of something organic rather than stone. The atmosphere was thick with the sense of ancient power, and Ethan's heart raced as he took in the strange, alien landscape. Ahead of him, a figure appeared. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, but as it approached, its features became clearer. It was a monk, but unlike the spectral monks he had encountered before. This one was solid, real, not a ghost, but not entirely human either. His skin was pale, and his eyes glowed with an inner light that seemed to pierce straight into Ethan's soul. The monk's face was impassive, yet there was a deep sadness in his expression, as though he had seen too much and understood too little. "You have come," the monk said, his voice soft but filled with a strange power. His words echoed in the air, vibrating through the very ground beneath Ethan's feet. "You have crossed the threshold, and now you stand at the precipice of the unknown. Do you understand what that means?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He had crossed so many thresholds already, had endured so much horror, but this felt different. This place, this moment, felt final. There was no turning back now. But what did it mean? What had he truly awakened? I don't know," Ethan said, his voice hoarse with the weight of his exhaustion and confusion. "What is this place? What's happening?" The monk nodded slowly, as though he had anticipated this question. "This is the space between worlds," he said, his eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made him feel as though his every thought was being read. "It is the boundary between what you know and what lies beyond. The gem you touched, the altar, it was not merely an object. It was a key, a conduit to this place. And now you are here." Ethan's mind reeled with the implications. A key? He had known that the gem was important, but he hadn't realized the true significance of it. It wasn't just a source of power, it was a doorway, a passage between worlds, between life and death, between the living and the spirits that lingered in the dark corners of the earth. And by touching it, he had opened that door. But now that it was open, what was he meant to do? The monk's expression softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of compassion in his eyes. "You have a choice," the monk said, his voice almost tender. "You can leave this place, return to your world, and forget everything you have seen. You will remember nothing but a vague sense of unease, and your life will continue as it was before." Or the monk paused, as though weighing his next words carefully. "Or you can remain here in this liminal space and help restore the balance that has been broken. You can become part of something greater than yourself." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the monk's words sank in. The choice was impossible, yet it was clear. The path before him split into two stark options: return to the safety of the known, but carry the weight of an unanswered question forever, or stay in this strange, otherworldly place to confront whatever dark forces have been unleashed and fight to restore what had been lost. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on him, but Ethan knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. He had already crossed too many lines, seen too much, to simply walk away and pretend that nothing had happened. "I'll stay," Ethan said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I'll help restore the balance." The monk nodded, as though this was the answer he had been waiting for. "Then you are ready," he said simply. "The work begins now." As the monk's words echoed in the air, the strange, Glowing architecture around them seemed to shift, its patterns becoming more defined, more purposeful. Ethan's vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled forward once more. This time, however, there was no fear. Only a deep, unshakable certainty that this was his path now, the only path he could walk. The darkness was not gone, but it had shifted. It had changed, and Ethan, standing at the threshold of the unknown, knew that his journey was only just beginning. The monastery, once a place of horror and confusion, had now become the battleground for something far greater, a war between light and shadow, between life and death. And Ethan had chosen his side. The awakening had begun.